Jake had always dreamed of settling down in a quiet suburban neighborhood after years of undercover work. It had been exhausting pretending to be someone else all the time. Now, he was ready for peace, a normal life in a place where the only thing to worry about was the weather or lawn maintenance. So when he found a charming little house on the outskirts of town, he jumped at the opportunity. It was a perfect fit for him, located on a cul-de-sac with friendly neighbors and a nice front yard. He spent his days organizing his garage and settling into his new routine. He thought he had finally found the calm he longed for. The first few weeks were blissful. Jake enjoyed long mornings with coffee in hand, sitting on the porch, watching the world pass by. The neighbors waved as they walked their dogs or jogged by, and Jake would wave back, trying his best to blend in and be just another guy who had found a nice place to call home. One morning, he woke up to find a letter slipped under his front door. It was a bright white envelope with the logo of the Homeowners Association stamped across the top. Jake frowned. He had heard of HOAs before, but hadn't given them much thought until now. Opening the envelope, he scanned the letter. Inside, the HOA was informing him that his house needed to be repainted, as it did not meet the association's color guidelines. Jake read the letter twice in disbelief. His house was practically brand new, and the color was a neutral shade of beige that blended perfectly with the other homes in the neighborhood. He checked the exterior again, but couldn't see anything wrong. The paint was fresh and well-maintained, so why was the HOA sending him this warning? Confused, Jake tried to contact the HOA using the number provided on the letter, but no one picked up. After several attempts, he decided to drop by the HOA office the next day. When he arrived, the building was a small, unassuming structure at the edge of the neighborhood. The door was locked, and there was no one in sight. Jake knocked on the door and waited, but still no one answered. He checked the hours on the sign outside and saw that they should be open by now, but something didn't feel right. Frustrated but not ready to back down, Jake decided to send an email to the HOA president, Carl. The email was polite but firm, explaining his confusion about the letter and asking for clarification. He included pictures of his house to show that everything was in order, hoping for a reasonable response instead of the usual bureaucratic nonsense. A day passed and Jake heard nothing. No response to the email, no calls, nothing, just silence. It was becoming clear that this was more than just a mistake. Jake wasn't sure what was going on, but he wasn't about to let it slide. He had dealt with people trying to manipulate the system before in his line of work, but this was different. These were just regular homeowners, but their actions felt like something more sinister was at play. He decided to sit on it for a while and wait to see what would happen, but deep down he had a bad feeling something was coming, and it wouldn't be as simple as just repainting the house. That HOA had sent their warning, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to escalate things further. He had no idea just how far they were willing to go to push him out of his own home. The following week, Jake started receiving more letters from the HOA. They were piling up on his doorstep, and each one carried a more severe tone than the last one. Threatened fines if the paint wasn't redone within a certain time frame. Others gave him a deadline to repaint his house or face further legal action. Jake read each letter carefully and began to notice that the language was getting harsher with every new one. The fines were escalating, and the threats of a lawsuit were becoming more frequent. Jake tried to reach out again, calling the number on the latest letter and even leaving messages for Carl, but still there was no response. It seemed like the HOA was doing everything it could to avoid speaking to him. The more Jake thought about it, the more frustrated he became. It was clear they were trying to push him into a corner, and he wasn't going to let that happen. It wasn't long before Jake started noticing strange things happening around the neighborhood. Cars parked too close to his house, people he didn't recognize walking by his property with their eyes lingering on his front door. One morning, he even saw two men standing by the sidewalk, staring at his house for what felt like hours. They didn't say anything or approach the door, they just watched. It was unsettling, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to intimidate him. He decided to confront the HOA directly at the next meeting. After all, he was a law-abiding citizen who had done nothing wrong. The neighborhood was peaceful and clean, and yet he was being harassed over something as trivial as the color of his house. He knew it wasn't just about the paint. There was something deeper going on, something that made him uneasy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The day of the HOA meeting, Jake prepared himself. He read through the HOA guidelines one more time just to be sure his house was in compliance, and even printed out the relevant sections to bring with him. When he walked into the community center that evening, he was met with a room full of faces, some familiar and some unfamiliar, all seated in a semicircle in front of a table where Carl sat at the head. Jake stood in the back waiting for the meeting to start. His eyes scanning the room. He felt the eyes of the board members on him, as if they were already sizing him up. His instincts were telling him something was wrong. The tension in the air was thick, and he couldn't tell if it was just the usual HOA politics or if there was something more sinister at play. When the meeting started, Carl immediately called on Jake to speak. He stood up and approached the front of the room, calmly holding up the documents he prepared for them. He explained the situation to the board and asked why he was being targeted with such aggressive action over a house color. Carl listened, but his eyes were cold and unblinking. He didn't seem interested in a reasonable discussion. Instead, Carl deflected and dismissed Jake's questions with vague answers and sarcastic remarks. The more Jake pushed back, the more defensive Carl became. Eventually, Carl raised his voice and ordered Jake to sit down. When Jake didn't comply, Carl's tone changed. He gestured to the two men sitting on either side of him, the so-called HOA security. Without warning, the two men stood up and began walking toward Jake. Their steps measured and deliberate. One of them placed a hand on Jake's shoulder and told him to leave the meeting. Jake was taken aback, but he stood his ground, refusing to back down or give in to intimidation. He calmly explained that he was simply exercising his right to speak at a public meeting, but the men's grip tightened. One of them spoke again, this time more forcefully, demanding that Jake leave the room now. Jake felt a wave of anger rising within him, but he kept his cool. It was clear the HOA wasn't just playing by the rules. They were trying to intimidate him into submission, and Jake wasn't the type to give up without a fight. As the two men closed in on Jake, he stood tall, refusing to move an inch. Their grip on his shoulder tightened, but Jake refused to let the fear show on his face. He knew what they were trying to do. They were hoping he would get scared and leave, so they could continue with their little show of power, but Jake wasn't about to let them have the satisfaction. The man on his right leaned in closer with a sneer and told Jake to get out of the meeting, or they would call the police. Jake wasn't sure whether they were bluffing or if they really thought they had the authority to make that call, but either way, he wasn't going to be pushed around. He slowly turned his head toward the door and made eye contact with Carl, who was sitting behind the table watching the scene unfold with an air of smug satisfaction. Carl clearly enjoyed watching Jake struggle, but Jake wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. In one swift motion, Jake removed the man's hand from his shoulder and took a step back. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply looked at the two men and said calmly, "I don't think you know who you're dealing with." The two men exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Jake took a step forward, making sure they understood. He wasn't intimidated by their size or their false sense of authority. He wasn't just some guy they could push around. He was a cop, an undercover cop, who had dealt with worse than this without breaking a sweat. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his police badge. The room fell silent as the men stared at it in shock. The confidence that had been radiating from Carl suddenly faded as his face drained of color. The men standing next to Jake now looked like deer caught in headlights. They had clearly underestimated him. Jake held the badge up for everyone to see. "I don't think you want to be messing with me," he said with a cool calm that made the tension in the room even more palpable. Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to regain control of the situation, but Jake could see the cracks in his confidence. The two men looked at each other and then back at Jake, who was still standing with his badge visible in the air. They hesitated before slowly taking a step back. One of them muttered something under his breath and then turned to walk away. The other followed without another word. Jake kept his eyes locked on Carl, who was now visibly rattled. The rest of the board members sat frozen in place, not knowing how to react, but Jake could tell they were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't going to go the way Carl had planned. Jake took a step toward the table where Carl sat and in a low voice said, "I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's going on here." Carl's eyes darted to the other board members, as if looking for someone to back him up, but no one moved. They were all suddenly aware that they had underestimated the man standing before them. Jake continued, "You don't get to treat people like this. You don't get to threaten and intimidate anyone who disagrees with you, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Carl looked at Jake for a moment, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jake cut him off. "I suggest you stop making threats and start listening, because if this continues, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you've been up to." Carl's face tightened as Jake turned to leave, but before he could walk away, Carl muttered something under his breath. Jake didn't catch the words, but he didn't need to. He already knew exactly what Carl was thinking. Jake had exposed him for what he really was, and there was no way Carl was going to forget that. As Jake walked out of the room, he could feel the eyes of the board members on him. They were all watching in stunned silence as he left the building, but Jake wasn't concerned with them. He had made his point, and now it was time to take action. He knew the HOA wasn't going to back down so easily, but Jake was ready for whatever came next, because he had just shown them who was really in charge. Jake spent the next few days in a quiet, simmering fury. He knew that Carl and the rest of the HOA board weren't going to take his confrontation lightly. They would retaliate, but he wasn't about to let them intimidate him again. Jake was used to the pressure of high-stakes situations, but this was personal, and he wasn't going to let it slide. His phone remained eerily quiet after the meeting. No calls from the HOA, no response to his warnings. It was as if they were trying to pretend nothing had happened, but Jake wasn't fooled. He knew they were just waiting for the right moment to strike, and that moment would come soon. That afternoon, Jake was on his porch enjoying the late afternoon sun when he saw something that made his blood run cold. A tow truck had pulled up to the curb in front of his house. The driver climbed out and walked up to his truck parked in his driveway. Without any warning, Jake's heart started racing. He knew that truck wasn't supposed to be towed. It was his property, and it was parked legally according to the neighborhood's guidelines. He jumped off his porch and rushed toward the truck, but the driver didn't even acknowledge him. He just started hooking it up to tow away. Jake's first instinct was to grab his phone and call the police, but then he realized something. He had been here before in other situations where people tried to pull the rug out from under him when they thought no one was watching. Jake marched up to the tow truck and banged his fist on the window. The driver looked up at him with a confused expression. Jake was fuming, but he kept his voice steady. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. The driver hesitated and then rolled down the window. "I was instructed by the HOA to tow this vehicle," he replied with a shrug. Jake couldn't believe his ears. "The HOA doesn't have the right to tow my truck," Jake snapped, but the driver just shook his head. "They said it was in violation of some rule." Jake clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. They had gone too far. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was outright theft. Jake pulled his phone out and snapped a picture of the tow truck and the driver's badge as evidence before turning on his heels and heading back toward his house. He wasn't going to let them take his truck. He knew he had to act fast. He made a quick call to his lawyer, explaining what had just happened and the next steps they needed to take. But before he could even hang up the phone, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Two men wearing HOA shirts were walking up his driveway, looking like they were ready for a confrontation. Jake recognized them immediately as the same two men who had tried to drag him out of the meeting. They had a smug look on their faces as they approached. Jake felt a surge of irritation, but he didn't let it show. He crossed his arms and waited for them to speak. They stopped a few feet from him, and one of the men spoke first. "You need to move that truck," he said, his voice tripping with authority. Jake took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. "I told you before, you don't have the power to move my truck," Jake replied evenly. The man took a step closer and sneered. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone threatening. Jake knew this was just the beginning of the HOA's retaliation, but he wasn't backing down. He looked the men in the eye and said, "If you try anything to my truck, you'll regret it." The men exchanged uncertain glances, but didn't say anything else. Instead, they turned and walked away without another word. Jake stood there watching them as they retreated, but he knew this wasn't over. He could feel the storm brewing and knew that the HOA wouldn't stop until they had forced him out of his own home. But Jake wasn't about to let them win. He had already come too far, and now it was time to make sure they knew exactly who they were messing with. With his truck still in the driveway, Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they tried again, but this time he would be ready for them. No more threats, no more intimidation. Jake was done playing their game, and he was going to take them down one step at a time. The next few days were tense. Jake could feel the pressure building, but he wasn't about to back down. He had already faced down these HOA goons before, and now he was prepared for whatever they had planned next. It wasn't just about the truck anymore, it was about standing his ground and showing them that they couldn't bully him out of his home. The evening of the next HOA meeting, Jake was ready. He had no idea what Carl and the rest of the board were planning, but he knew it wouldn't be a simple conversation. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the HOA wasn't just acting out of some misguided sense of authority. They were trying to control the entire neighborhood, trying to assert power over everyone who lived there, and Jake wasn't going to let them get away with it. As he entered the community center for the meeting, Jake could already feel the tension in the air. It was palpable, like the calm before the storm. The board members were sitting at their usual table, and Carl sat at the head of the room looking smug as usual. When he saw Jake walk in, his smile faded just a little, but he quickly recovered and motioned for Jake to come forward. Jake walked up to the front of the room and stood tall. He didn't let the sneers or whispers from the board members affect him. He had a plan, and he wasn't going to let these people intimidate him any longer. Carl started the meeting with his usual self-important tone, but Jake wasn't here to listen to the same old speech about rules and regulations. He was here to make a stand. Carl wasted no time in addressing Jake directly. "I see you've decided to show up again, Jake," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We've already told you multiple times about your violations, and you continue to ignore us. Do you really think you're above the rules of this community?" Jake didn't flinch. He knew this was coming, but he was ready for it. "I don't think I'm above the rules," Jake said calmly, "but I do think you're abusing your power and trying to force me to comply with rules that don't exist." Carl's smile faltered just slightly, but he quickly recovered. "I think you're the one who's confused, Jake," he said. "We've already given you multiple chances to comply, but you refuse to listen. Maybe it's time we escalate things further." Jake's gut tightened. He knew exactly what Carl was implying, but he wasn't about to let it go any further without a fight. "You've already tried to intimidate me with threats and towing my truck illegally," Jake said, his voice growing stronger. "Now you're going to threaten me with more escalation, but I'm not backing down." Carl's eyes narrowed, but Jake could see the hesitation in his face. For the first time, the so-called HOA president wasn't sure what to do next, but he wasn't going to show weakness in front of the others. "You think you can just walk in here and talk to us like that?" Carl said, his tone rising. "We're not afraid of you." Jake took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "I think you should be afraid of me, Carl," he said quietly, "because I'm not just some guy you can push around. I'm a law enforcement officer, and if you keep this up, I will have no problem putting an end to your little game." The room went silent as Jake's words hung in the air. The board members shifted nervously in their seats, glancing at each other as the reality of the situation began to set in. Carl's face turned red as he struggled to find a response, but no words came out. He had no idea how to handle this. He had thought Jake was just another homeowner to bully, but now he was faced with the reality that he was dealing with someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. Jake didn't wait for Carl to recover. He pulled out his badge and held it up for everyone in the room to see. The effect was immediate. Carl's face drained of color as he looked at the badge, and then at Jake, who was standing there with a calm confidence that only came from knowing he had the law on his side. "You want to escalate this, Carl," Jake said, his voice steady, "because I can promise you that if you try anything else, I will have every right to take legal action against you and your board." Jake didn't need to shout or make threats. He knew the law, and he knew how to use it to his advantage. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room as the reality of the situation set in. Carl shifted in his seat, trying to regain some control, but Jake could tell he was rattled. The board members were now visibly uncomfortable as they looked from Carl to Jake, unsure of what would happen next. Finally, Carl stood up, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to save face. "You've made your point, Jake," he said, But Jake wasn't about to let him off easy. "No, Carl," Jake replied. "You've made your point, and now I'm making mine." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving the HOA board to stew in their defeat. Jake woke up the next morning feeling a strange sense of calm despite everything that had happened the night before. He knew that confronting that HOA had been the right move, but the fight was far from over. The whole neighborhood was watching now, and he knew the HOA wouldn't back down so easily. They had a sense of power. They were used to getting their way, but Jake had a plan, and he wasn't going to let them push him any further. As the days passed, Jake stayed vigilant. He kept an eye on his property, making sure no one came around trying to pull anything suspicious. That HOA had already shown that they weren't afraid to break the rules to get what they wanted, but Jake wasn't going to let them get away with it. Then came the first sign of retaliation one morning. As Jake walked out of his front door, he saw a flyer stuck to his mailbox. The letter was from the HOA, and it was another list of supposed violations, but this time it was different. The violations were entirely fabricated. It accused him of things he had never done, like failing to mow his lawn or keeping garbage cans out for too long, things that simply weren't true. Jake's blood began to boil as he read through the letter, but he knew what he had to do. He took a picture of the flyer and then called his lawyer to discuss his next steps. He wasn't going to let the HOA get away with these false accusations. They were escalating things now, and Jake wasn't going to let them drag his name through the mud. The lawyer advised Jake to keep all evidence of the harassment and violations and to stay calm while preparing for the next move. Jake took the advice seriously, but he also knew that time was running out for Carl and his board. If they kept pushing, they would regret it. A few days later, Jake received a call from his lawyer saying that they were preparing to file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment and defamation. Jake couldn't help but smile. He had been patient, but now he was ready to fight back with everything he had. He was done playing by their rules. When Jake showed up at the next HOA meeting, he was prepared for war. He walked in with his lawyer by his side, and it didn't take long for the tension to build. Carl didn't even try to hide his disdain. As Jake and his lawyer sat down at the table, Carl immediately launched into his usual tirade about the rules and regulations of the neighborhood, but this time Jake wasn't having it. "I've had enough, Carl," Jake said, his voice loud and clear. "You and your board have been harassing me for months now, and I'm done with it." Carl looked surprised, but quickly regained his composure. "You've been given plenty of chances to comply with the rules, Jake, but instead you've chosen to cause trouble." Jake leaned forward, his eyes locked on Carl's. "You've been lying to the entire neighborhood and harassing me for no reason," he said. "And now I'm taking legal action. I'm suing you for defamation and harassment." Carl's face went pale as Jake's words sank in. He tried to compose himself, but the board members were starting to look uncomfortable. "I don't think you understand the consequences of what you're doing, Carl," Jake continued. "This isn't just about my house anymore. It's about everything you've done to try and bully everyone in this neighborhood." Carl's mouth went dry as the room went silent. The other board members sat still watching the exchange unfold, but Jake could tell they were starting to turn against Carl one by one. He could see their doubt creeping in. Some of them were shifting in their seats and exchanging glances, but Carl didn't notice. He was too busy trying to hold onto whatever was left of his control. Jake stood up to leave, but before he did, he turned to Carl one last time. "This is your last chance, Carl," he said calmly. "You can stop this now and admit what you've done, or I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." With that, Jake and his lawyer walked out of the meeting, leaving Carl and the HOA board to sit in stunned silence. They had no idea what to do next. The tables had turned, and for the first time in months, Jake felt like he was in control. The battle wasn't over yet, but Jake was ready for whatever Carl and the HOA tried to throw his way. He had already shown them that he wasn't someone to mess with, and he wasn't going to stop until they paid for their actions. The days following the meeting were tense. Jake knew the HOA wasn't going to take the lawsuit lightly. Carl was a proud man who wasn't used to being challenged, and Jake could see that he would go to any lengths to maintain control of the neighborhood. But Jake was prepared for the fight. He had already taken the first step by calling their bluff, and now it was time to hold his ground. The next few days were filled with paperwork, meetings with his lawyer, and constant phone calls with the HOA as Carl and the board tried to negotiate a way out of the legal battle. But Jake wasn't interested in negotiating. He wasn't going to let them off the hook for what they had done. He had seen enough of their manipulation, and he wasn't going to allow them to run his life or anyone else's. One afternoon, Jake received a call from Carl himself. The phone call came out of the blue, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he answered. "Jake, I know this has gone too far, and I want to settle this before it gets worse," Carl said, his voice low and filled with frustration. Jake knew that Carl was trying to maintain some semblance of power, but Jake wasn't going to let him off easy. "I've already made it clear, Carl," Jake replied. "I'm not backing down. You've lied and bullied people for too long, and now you'll face the consequences." Carl sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "I understand that you're upset, but you need to understand this isn't just about you. This is about the whole neighborhood," he said, trying to justify his actions. Jake clenched his jaw and took a deep breath. "It's exactly about me, Carl. It's about what you've been doing to me and everyone else who's too afraid to stand up to you." Jake's voice was steady, but his words cut deep. Carl didn't have a response immediately. Instead, there was a long silence on the line before he finally spoke. "What do you want, Jake?" he asked, his voice sounding defeated. "I want you to come clean, Carl," Jake said. "I want you to admit everything you've done to this community and apologize to everyone you've tried to control." Carl hesitated for a moment before answering. "I can't do that, Jake. I've worked too hard to get where I am." Jake's patience was wearing thin. "You've worked too hard to manipulate and control everyone around you, Carl. You've abused your position for far too long, and it's time for you to pay." Jake hung up the phone without another word. Jake knew that Carl wouldn't back down without a fight, but the stakes were too high now. Jake wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone in the neighborhood who had been bullied into silence over the years. It wasn't just about the illegal towing, the false violations, or the harassment. It was about the way Carl and the board had used their power to make life miserable for anyone who didn't fit their idea of the perfect neighbor. A few days later, Jake received another notice from the HOA. This one was different. It wasn't a list of violations or threats. It was a formal request for a meeting between Jake and the board. Carl had apparently decided to try to resolve things privately before the lawsuit went any further. Jake wasn't sure if this was a genuine attempt to make amends or if Carl was simply trying to save face, but he wasn't about to walk into another trap. Jake consulted with his lawyer before making a decision. They both agreed that it would be best to go to the meeting and see what Carl had to offer, but Jake made it clear that he wasn't going to back down, no matter what Carl said. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jake walked into the HOA office with his lawyer. By his side, the atmosphere in the room was cold and tense. Carl sat at the head of the table, his expression stoic as he looked at Jake and his lawyer across the table. "I know this has been difficult for both sides," Carl began, "but I think we can come to a resolution here without further escalation." Jake didn't interrupt. He simply listened as Carl went on. "I'm willing to make some concessions, but you need to understand that there are rules in place that we can't just ignore." Jake looked directly at Carl. "I don't care about your rules, Carl," he said. "I care about the way you've treated people and the way you've tried to control this neighborhood." Carl's face twitched, but he kept his composure. "We've made mistakes, Jake," he said finally, "but we're willing to fix them if you're willing to work with us." Jake considered the offer for a moment, but then shook his head. "I'm done working with you, Carl," he said. "This is no longer about compromise, it's about justice." He stood up and looked around the room. "You had your chance, and you blew it." With that, Jake and his lawyer left the room and walked out of the building, leaving Carl and the board to face the reality of their actions. Jake knew that the war wasn't over, but he was closer than ever to ending it. He had already taken the first steps toward making sure Carl and the HOA faced the consequences of their abuse, and now there was no turning back. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal motions and back-and-forth negotiations, but Jake felt a sense of resolve growing stronger each day. He knew that Carl and the HOA had underestimated him from the very beginning. They had assumed that with enough pressure he would fold, but Jake wasn't someone who gave up easily. He had already committed himself to seeing this through no matter what. Jake's lawyer kept him updated on the progress of the case. Carl's team was scrambling, trying to find a way to settle the issue without it going public, but Jake wasn't interested in sweeping things under the rug. He wanted justice not just for himself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been silenced by the HOA's bullying tactics. Carl was starting to crack under the pressure. The once confident leader of the HOA was now making desperate moves to save face. He had tried to rally the board to support him, but the tide had turned, and many of the board members were beginning to see the truth behind Jake's accusations. The community had begun to turn against Carl, and the HOA's influence was beginning to wane. One afternoon, Jake received an unexpected phone call. It was from one of the HOA board members, a woman named Margaret who had been with the organization for years. She had always kept a low profile and had never been vocal about the board's actions, but now she was reaching out to Jake. Her voice was shaky when she spoke. "Jake, I need to talk to you," Margaret said, her tone urgent. "I don't know how much longer I can stay silent." Jake was taken aback, but he listened as Margaret continued. "I've seen the way Carl has run things behind the scenes. It's not right. I didn't want to be involved, but I can't ignore it anymore. I want to help you." Jake knew that this was a crucial moment. Margaret had information that could change the course of the entire case, but he didn't know how far she was willing to go. "What do you want to do, Margaret?" Jake asked quietly. "I want to testify against Carl," Margaret replied. "I want to show the world the truth about what's been going on in this community." Jake felt a surge of hope. This could be the breakthrough he needed. Margaret had the inside knowledge that could expose Carl for the fraud. It was the kind of evidence that would make all the difference in court. "If you're serious about this, Margaret, I'll make sure you're protected," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'm serious, Jake," Margaret replied. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Jake agreed to meet her the next day at a quiet cafe where they could talk in private. Margaret told him everything she knew about Carl's shady practices, the ways he had manipulated the board and the community, the lies he had spread to keep people in line. Margaret's testimony was damning, but it was also exactly what Jake needed to take the fight to the next level. With her help, he had the evidence to prove that Carl had used his position of power for personal gain and had abused the trust of the neighborhood for years. The next morning, Jake's lawyer was already preparing to submit the new evidence to the court. Carl had no idea what was coming. He had thought he could keep his secrets buried, but now the truth was coming to light, and there was no stopping it. Carl was blindsided when he received the news about Margaret's testimony. He called an emergency board meeting in an attempt to rally support, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. As the community began to hear about the truth behind Carl's actions, more and more people came forward with their own stories of how they had been mistreated by the HOA. Carl's support among the board members began to crumble as the weight of the evidence mounted. Some of them distanced themselves from him completely, and others began to openly question his leadership. They had never expected such a massive shift in public opinion, but now they were faced with the reality of their actions. Jake watched all of this unfold with a sense of satisfaction. He had known from the start that the HOA couldn't keep hiding behind their lies and manipulation, but seeing it all come crashing down was still a bit of victory. Carl's days as the HOA president were numbered, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the truth spread throughout the entire neighborhood. The day finally came when Carl was forced to step down as president of the HOA. His resignation was a public admission of defeat, but it wasn't enough. Jake wanted more. He wanted accountability, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. He had fought for justice and had won, but he knew that the battle wasn't truly over until Carl faced the consequences of his actions. Jake stood in front of his house that evening, looking at the neighborhood around him. He had taken on the HOA and come out victorious, but it wasn't just about the victory. It was about reclaiming the sense of fairness and respect that had been lost in the community. He had done more than just fight for his own property. He had fought for everyone who had been too afraid to speak up, and now the neighborhood would finally be free from the stranglehold of the HOA. The days following Carl's resignation were filled with change. The neighborhood felt different, as though a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. The atmosphere that had once been stifling with fear and distrust began to shift towards something lighter. People were starting to talk to each other again. They were sharing stories and experiences of the way that HOA had treated them, and for the first time in a long while there was a sense of community forming. Jake knew that Carl's resignation was just the beginning. The battle for justice wasn't truly over until the HOA was completely restructured and the people who had been wronged received the recognition they deserved. But for the first time, Jake felt a sense of relief. He had stood up to the powers that had tried to control him, and he had come out on top. It didn't take long for Carl to realize the full extent of his defeat. He had underestimated Jake from the very beginning, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. Jake received word that Carl had hired a high-powered lawyer to try and fight back, but Jake wasn't worried. He knew that the truth was on his side, and no amount of money or influence could change that. The real challenge now was rebuilding the trust within the community. Carl had done far more damage than anyone had realized, and it wasn't going to be easy to undo the fear and manipulation that had been spread over the years, but Jake was determined to make things right. He started meeting with other homeowners, organizing small neighborhood meetings where people could voice their concerns and share their experiences. Jake made it clear that the HOA was not going to run the community anymore, and that things would be different from now on. He wasn't trying to replace the HOA entirely, but he wanted to create a more democratic system, one where every homeowner had a voice and the rules were transparent and fair. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood began to heal. Jake's efforts to create a more inclusive community were met with enthusiasm. People were tired of living in fear, and they were ready for change. The meetings became a regular event, and slowly but surely people began to open up and speak their minds. Jake's reputation as someone who had fought for justice and won spread throughout the area, and more people began to support his vision for the future. Meanwhile, Carl was doing everything he could to salvage what was left of his reputation. He tried to reach out to the homeowners in a desperate attempt to regain their favor, but the damage had already been done. The community had turned against him, and no matter what he said or did, he couldn't undo the harm he had caused. Jake watched from the sidelines as Carl's attempts to reclaim his position failed time and time again. It was clear to everyone that Carl was no longer the leader of the neighborhood, and it was time for new blood to take over the HOA. Finally, the day came when the HOA was officially restructured. Jake was elected as one of the new board members, but he made it clear that his role wasn't about power. It was about ensuring that the neighborhood's interests were protected and that no one would ever again face the same kind of oppression that Carl had imposed on them. The new board worked together to create a fairer set of rules that everyone could agree on. They focused on building a sense of community rather than enforcing petty regulations. They encouraged open dialogue and transparency, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a place where people could live without fear. Jake had fought hard for this victory, but it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been hurt by Carl's reign. It was about standing up for what was right and ensuring that no one would ever again be made to feel powerless in their own community. Looking around at the neighborhood, Jake knew that the fight had been worth it. The people here were stronger now. They had learned the value of standing up for themselves, and together they had taken back their home from the grip of a corrupt HOA. Jake couldn't help but smile as he stood in his yard, watching the children playing and the neighbors chatting in the streets. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was a new beginning. And for Jake, that was enough. He had won the battle, but the real victory was seeing the community finally free from the fear and control that had once held it hostage.